Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. What's going on in China and Japan and Korea and Vietnam and Asia generally is the topic tonight with Stephen Nagy, who is a professor of politics and international studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo, Japan. He's joining us right now from Tokyo. He's also a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute here in Canada, a senior fellow with the Asia-Pacific Foundation, a fellow with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, and on and on. I could go through his resume. This gentleman has, I've had the honor of interviewing him before. He's very knowledgeable. He's written numerous different articles and academic papers on different issues in Asia. But really what I want to talk about now is how you think, Stephen, Asia is and will respond to Donald Trump and how the power dynamics work between President Xi in China, and also, how South Korea, how Japan, how Vietnam are responding, are going to respond. So tell me, how do you see things changing of late?
Well, thanks, Brian. I think it's really important to know that, for your listeners to know that the region is very heterogeneous. So there's not one response. They're actually looking at what's happening out of Washington, looking at the daily headlines. And I think some countries have no idea what's going to come next. And other countries are a little bit more confident in their positioning vis-a-vis the United States and vis-a-vis, of course, the tariffs. So let's start with I think, the one that's a little bit more reliable, and that's Japan. Japan, of course, has an alliance partnership with the United States. If we think about its relationship with the United States over the past 150, 160, 170 years, except for the war, by and large on the same page of the book about security, about trade, about economics. And Japan has looked at the United States and looked at the shift in politics in the United States for a long time. And they identified that the Republicans would come in. They identified that they would be more isolationist. They identified that they would be less free trade oriented way back in 2010. And what they've done to try to seed the policy debate on the Republican side is put what we call chair researchers in conservative think tanks, so that they were actually seeding policy to the conservative think tanks to basically say, Japan is part of making America great again. And guess what?
Japan is part of making America great again. Really?
Absolutely. That's what they have done. And if America wants to be great again, it actually needs Japan. So Japan has a very different position, and they've had a good relationship with the current president. And as a result, I think that they will avoid the worst of the tariffs. They'll continue to strengthen the relationship and deepen their partnership. But that's not the same with Beijing. Beijing is a strategic competitor for the United States. It's a serial violator of intellectual property rights. It's a serial violator of the WTO, that's the World Trade Organization. And what we see is that Beijing is facing 125, 145% tariffs on the products that it sells to the biggest consumer market on the planet. That's the United States. This is not good for China. It is still a manufacturing-based society, and it's impossible for them to shift $100 or $800 billion of trade, $800 billion, I said that right, to another market around the world. So they're in big trouble, and they're trying to figure out how to manage this relationship. South Korea, I'll just stop after South Korea.
But it's also pretty difficult for American consumers to stop their addiction to cheap Chinese goods, is it not?
I totally agree. I don't think that they can get rid of that addiction yet. But again, when you're selling $800 billion of cheap goods to the United States, who are you going to sell that to next? The Japanese aren't going to buy them, and they're a rich country. Europe is not going to buy them. Africa doesn't have the money. India doesn't have the money. So where do you shift that consumer market to? And that is the conundrum for Chinese leaders. And you may say, well, just lay off people. The problem is you have to lay off tens of millions, if not more, of people. And I don't know which country can absorb, tens of millions of unemployed workers. So China's in a really tough place. And right now they're putting on a tough face. They're trying to match the tariffs of the United States. But in reality, their economy right now is stagnating. We have 20 to 25% youth unemployment. Property prices are down, and consumer confidence is way, way down. It's a tough place for China right now as they try to face the tariffs coming out of the United States.
So, you think about all of the goods that are shipped into the United States, and you think about, Walmart and Costco and all those big American retailers. They're making what, 25 to 50% margins, and so that they need those products to be profitable. And there's probably an importer in there as well that's making a margin. And so when you think about that 100% tariff, it's not like all the goods are going to go up by, a factor of two right away. It's going to go up by something, but it's not going to go up by a factor of two, because the margins that the retailers enjoy and their labor costs doesn't go up. All the costs of the trucking in the United States doesn't go up. All the importers' costs and the margins don't go up. So it goes up, but it doesn't go up by 100% at the store level in the United States. So you don't think the American big retailers are going to keep buying and just jack up their prices. You don't think that these tariffs are going to be paid for by the American consumer. You think what's going to happen is that they're going to stop buying Chinese goods.
Over the long term, I think that they're shifting away from the Chinese market, and that is not just because of the tariffs that have been laid by the Trump administration. In fact, the costs of goods coming out of China have increased over the past 10, 20 years. And this is just the normal cycle of economy. We often think that it was only China producing the stuff that we consume today. Post World War II, guess who produced it? It was the Japanese. And then after the Japanese, it was the newly industrialized economies of South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Guess what? After that, it was China. And guess what? After that, it was Southeast Asian countries, and on and on and on. So as countries move up through the what we call the value chain, they move away from producing cheap stuff, and they start to produce the more sophisticated stuff that runs our computers, runs our fridges, etc. So over time, costs of producing goods in China have increased. It's still real cheap, but I think that looking over the long term, we're going to find other places to produce the same stuff that we consume today. That's Southeast Asia, likely India. I have a bet on Central Europe right now that I think Central Europe is going to become another manufacturing hub for relatively cheap goods for European consumption. So I think looking at broader trends, it's important to, again, understand that China was moving up the value chain, and it couldn't sustain producing all that cheap stuff over the long term.
Okay, so you've got a property real estate market that's in challenge. You've got, as you said, youth unemployment that's high. You've got consumer confidence that's low. But you do have a communist party that's in control, and a president that seems more powerful than any president since Mao. So who's going to blink first, Trump or Xi?
Well, I think the Trump administration already blinked. Last week, the stock market tanked. Other indicators of I guess the barometers of how different parts of the market were looking at tariffs and said, well, this is not working for us. But he blinked. So he put 90-day pause on tariffs for most countries except for China. Now, where do we go in the next 90 to 90 days or 3-4 months? I think what we're likely to see is that many countries visit Washington. They come to some kind of agreement with the Trump administration. We've already seen the Vietnamese do that. And we will see where the Chinese are going. And if there is momentum on the downward pressure of the tariffs on the Chinese economy, the Trump administration may continue to put pressure if he feels like he's gotten some political wins from Vietnam, from Japan, from South Korea, from the Europeans. So it's a complicated picture of where we're headed, but I think we need to still wait really until June, July for, what is the real impact on prices and whether the Trump administration will pull back from tariffs, especially tariffs targeting China, because that is what the Trump administration understands as their biggest adversary and a competitor to how the Americans understand their primacy in the Indo-Pacific region that I live in.
It's interesting because, a lot of the Sunday news shows, both last Sunday and this Sunday in the United States, talked about what Trump accomplished, 2 weeks ago with Liberation Day, was isolating the United States and putting China in closer affiliation with a whole bunch of other countries worldwide. And maybe this week, when he switched and removed the barriers for 90 days on everyone else, other than China, he reversed it. So it'd be interesting to ask you, which we'll do after the break, about which you think it is. Is China more aligned with everyone else, or is China on its own? We're going to take a break for some messages and come back. And I'm also going to ask our expert about Vietnam, South Korea, the balance of Southeast Asia and where that puts it. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We've got Stephen Nagy with us today. He's a political science professor in Tokyo. He's a managing director of the Macdonald Law Institute. He's very involved in academic and also a commentator frequently on media about what's going on in Asia and also in relation to Canada. And so we're going to come back later on in this conversation about how everything impacts Canada, because Stephen's got a connections with Canada as well. Stephen, I got to ask you, before we get sort of back to China, about some of the other countries. You were about to talk about South Korea and Vietnam. Vietnam has visited the United States just recently. What do you think Vietnam, South Korea, India are going to be doing in this current environment?
Well, Vietnam's already gone to the Trump administration and said we would like to remove tariffs and engage in some economic reform to rectify the bilateral trade deficit between the two states. It's important because Vietnam has been the country that has benefited the most from I think a global shift on support for China's position within our global economy. So Vietnam has lots of cheap labor, it's access to ports, access to South China Sea, good relations with some of, I think, important partners like Japan, South Korea, Australia, the United States. It's seen as the future production network for global goods. So many businesses have migrated there because they knew they could make things cheaper. And the Trump administration, of course, put tariffs on Vietnam, and that meant that Vietnamese had to, either negotiate with the Trump administration or face a very negative impact on the development of their economy. And they said, well, you know what? It's more important to focus on development. Very forward-thinking leaders. At the same time, they understand that the geopolitical winds are in Vietnam's favor compared to China. So they have basically come to the table to say we're happy to rectify the trade deficit between the United States and Vietnam, and let's find a way to do it. South Korea is a bit more complicated. They have, their biggest trading partners with China. That's not going to change. They have a really great neighbor up north, North Korea, that's producing weapons of mass destruction and threatens them every day. It's a very highly destabilized place. But at the same time, they have this strong U.S. alliance, strong partnerships with the U.S., and they don't want to jeopardize that. So South Korea is really quite an interesting state, and it's the country that may actually flip in terms of its partnership with the United States. It's actively seeking to get its own nuclear deterrent to deter not only North Korea, but to get some strategic autonomy between the United States, China, and even Japan. It is a really fascinating place, and the Trump administration's tariffs may push it in the direction that the U.S. may not actually like.
Whoa, that's interesting. That's the first time I've heard that. So you're thinking South Korea may actually get farther away from the United States and want to have its own nuclear deterrence itself. Gosh, I don't know about a world where both North and South Korea both have a nuclear bomb. That's not a world that I like.
It's not a world that I like, but this is the direction of weapons proliferation. And, the Chinese are committed to about 3,500 nuclear weapons in the next 10, 15 years to keep up with the United States. So we're seeing weapons proliferation. And I think the tariffs may push North Korea or South Korea in a direction that's probably going to only contribute to that proliferation process.
Do you think that sort of the lesson of Ukraine is you can't count on the promise of deterrence from other countries? You got to have the nuclear weapon yourself?
Well, South Korea is a bit of a special case, North Korea is, on its border. It has nuclear weapons. It's now contributing to Russia's war effort with Ukraine and by putting troops there. Russians have provided sensitive satellite technology and other technology to further contribute to the development of nuclear weapons in the north. If I was South Korean, that's probably the choice I would be making as well. And historically, South Korea's or the Korean Peninsula has always been squeezed between big powers, and a nuclear deterrent is a possible, get out of jail free card, as we would say if we were playing Monopoly, allowing them to have a lot more strategic autonomy vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis the United States, and unfortunately vis-a-vis Japan.
Tell me about India. Modi, a lot of people thought was very close to Trump and had a sort of a strongman image, similar to what Donald Trump wanted. But it got a lot of big tariff, reciprocal tariff threats as well. What do you think about India's current situation?
Well, I do believe that India and the United States are going to continue to deepen their relationship. And I think you're correct. The Trump administration and the Modi administration really had good dynamics. Many Indians actually admire the Trump administration and Mr. Trump himself. And this may come to a surprise for Canadians who are right now, livid with the treatment that the Trump administration has given Canada. But in India, it's a totally different dynamic. The reciprocal tariffs will probably be used by the Modi administration to enact some deregulation and some economic change in India, which is badly needed. They couldn't get support for. And I think India is looking for, again, how it can strengthen its relationship with the United States at the same time modernize its economy. So it's a give and take. I think that they'll find a way to work through the tariffs, and that the United States, whether it's with Mr. Trump or without Mr. Trump, understand that India is a key part of its broader strategy to constrain China's economic development and ensure that China isn't the country that is the dominant player in the broader Indo-Pacific or Asia region.
Okay, so I got to ask you about Taiwan. Where does Taiwan fit into all of this? And I guess in relation to Donald Trump and tariffs and chips, I guess is the big issue. But then more importantly, frankly, where is Taiwan vis-a-vis potential invasion from China? As the United States has become less defensive of Ukraine as it's gone from Biden to Trump in the presidency, has the lesson been given to China that no one will stand up for Taiwan, like Trump's not standing up for Ukraine? And does the probability, particularly given less sort of cohesive geopolitical cohesion, mean, because of the Trump tariffs, does this mean that the probability of an invasion of Taiwan has gone up in the last couple of weeks?
Well, there is a lot of writing suggesting that China is preparing for an invasion of Taiwan over the next 6 months, or at least during the Trump administration. And that writing, whether you agree with it or not, is there. I generally think that the Chinese don't want to invade Taiwan. They'll take every other option to reunify with Taiwan into the mainland. And the Chinese use the word reunify, and this is probably a nuance for your listeners that you may not understand. But they use reunify because in the People's Republic of China's mindset, Taiwan was always part of China. The Taiwanese don't say that. They say unify. The Taiwanese believe that they were actually never part of mainland China. And as a result, if there's ever a unification with China, that it would have to be through negotiation. Now, are we closer to some kind of conflict? We're always closer. And I think that the Chinese have learned from Russia's failed invasion of Ukraine. It was failed. They're still fighting. They're trapped in a conflict. I don't think they can get out easily. They've seen how the Russians have been cut off from the global financial system. They've seen the impact on trade, on outside medicines coming into Russia. The very fact that Russia's planes rely on Western technologies to fly, and meaning that they can't get those parts, means that the domestic transport system has become less reliable in Russia. I don't know about you, but if I was in Canada and those Air Canada planes or WestJet or whatever the company is couldn't replace their parts for 3 years, would you want to be flying on those planes? So I think that when we think about China's position, they're studying how the Russians failed to conquer Ukraine quickly, and they're looking at how they can prevent this from happening. Where does the Trump administration sit on Taiwan? they understand that 2.3 trillion US dollars of trade goes around Taiwan every year. 2.3 trillion.
That's huge.
Um, that's huge. That's almost the size of the Canadian economy. The straits that connect the South China Sea is about 5.5 trillion US dollars. This is not insignificant. And by some estimates, up to 10% of the global GDP would be taken out if there was a conflict across the Taiwan Strait. So about $10 trillion. It's not inconsequential. And I think the Trump administration and advisors understand this. And as a result, they have moved back to what we call strategic ambiguity. So not saying they're going to defend Taiwan, not saying they're not going to defend Taiwan, so that it increases the cost for the Chinese to attempt a reunification through force. Unfortunately, the United States has reliable partners like Japan that I think have also stepped up to the plate and said that Taiwan's a global public good. It's in the interest of the global economy that peace and stability and the status quo across the Taiwan Strait remains the same, regardless of what is the political status of Taiwan. So in that sense, I'm a little bit more confident that Taiwan will not be attacked anytime soon. The potential downside for the Chinese is not just enormous; it's consequential. It would likely destabilize their political system and their entire economy. And this is not the cost that the Chinese Communist Party would like to pay to reunify with Taiwan when they don't really have to.
If they attacked, would the United States come to defend?
We don't know. My feeling is yes, because without Taiwan, without Taiwan being politically independent, but let's say it's not identified within the not recognized within the United Nations as an independent country, would fundamentally erode away the United States' access to the Indo-Pacific region, its trade relationships, its strong partnerships. And this would make America weaker, less prosperous, less rich, and less consequential. And in my understanding of U.S. foreign policy over the past 250 years, its prime objective has been to retain primacy. And Taiwan is an important part of that equation.
This has been an excellent canvas of that area of the world. Thank you. I can't not ask you about Hong Kong. We get quite frequently comments about people still immigrating to Canada from Hong Kong, and they're not happy with what's happening there. How do you see Hong Kong right now?
Well, back in 2020 June, the Chinese government enacted what's called a national security law, and it's basically crushed freedom of press and destroyed the 1984 Sino-UK agreement, Sino-British agreement, which basically said that they'd guarantee that Hong Kong could maintain their way of life for the next 50 years. So today, we understand Hong Kong as just another Chinese city subject to domestic Chinese law. So if you were to make a comment about Xi Jinping or make a comment that is against the Chinese Communist Party, you could be incarcerated or worse. There's no freedom of press in Hong Kong anymore, which means the kinds of newspapers that people read are very pro-Beijing. And for many, this is a problem because, of course, many people in Hong Kong have grown up, with the freedoms that you and I as Canadians enjoy, the freedom of speech, rule of law, and this is a great worry for many people that they're subject to the kinds of laws that in China that really are arbitrary. And let me just give you an example. A couple of weeks ago, 4 Canadians, mind you, they were drug dealers. They broke the law in China, but they were executed. And we don't know the legal process behind that. And this is the kind of legal system that now exists in Hong Kong, and it's a great worry for many Hong Kong people. And if they can, they are moving out of Hong Kong, sending their money out and sending their children out because they are not confident in the legal system that used to protect their rights under that agreement between the UK and China.
So given what we've just described, what you've just described, and given the Liberation Day 2 weeks ago, where the whole world was subject to retaliatory tariffs that may or may not come back in 90 days, and may mean that, like Vietnam, everyone's got to trundle off to the Oval Office to negotiate whatever they can, versus this past week where every one of the country's retaliatory tariffs were removed except for China. Is China more isolated globally today or less isolated globally today?
Depends on the part of the world we're talking about. So there's no illusions in Tokyo or Seoul or Taiwan or Singapore or Hanoi about the nature of the Chinese government, about its long-term aspirations to dominate the region and to fundamentally transform our international system so that it's more compatible with the Chinese Communist Party's interests. I think there's no illusions. But at the same time, China remains the most important economy for all those economies. And this means that they have to find ways to coexist, but at the same time build the kinds of resilience in their economy so they're not subject to economic coercion, but also build deterrence in the case of military kinds of coercive activities. I was just in Europe last month. Similarly, the Europeans have no delusions about China. They're actually very worried about China dumping, cheap goods into the EU market. They're worried about EV vehicles destroying signature industries. Imagine Germany without Mercedes or Volkswagen. Imagine France without Renault and other vehicles. They are wondering, how is China going to respond to the U.S. tariffs, and will they potentially dump their products into other parts of the world? I was in Africa in February, and again, really growing views that the investments in Africa do come with hooks. They do come with issues, and there's growing skepticism about China's BRI, the Belt Road Initiative investments in Africa as well. So I think we need to be very careful when we think that China is benefiting from the chaos in the White House. In fact, they already have a long track record of coercion and exploitation in different parts of the world, and countries are worried. They're worried about, what is the predatory behavior that may come out of Beijing. And they look at examples such as Lithuania, that made a change of the Taiwanese representative office, and they were cut off from the Chinese economy. They look at Australia, that made calls for an investigation of the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic, and they were subject to tariffs. And, frankly, they look at what's happened to Canada in our bilateral relations with China, and they see that we're subject to political interference. We see active campaigns to support one candidate or the other. And again, as I mentioned, 4 Canadian citizens were recently executed in China for distributing illegal drugs. So I think that it's not so clear that China is gaining benefit from the chaos in the White House, even though it's trying.
Fascinating. We're going to turn to Canada now. We're going to take a break for some messages, and when we come back, I'm going to ask Stephen Nagy about how all of this impacts Canada. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. My guest tonight is Stephen Nagy, who is a professor, political science professor at the American Christian University in Tokyo, Japan. He's also a managing director with Macdonald-Laurier Institute here in Canada, and numerous other responsibilities. Sir, you have written 2 papers, probably a whole bunch more that I don't know about, but 2 papers actually about Canada and Canada's role recently. One was Reinventing Canada's Middle Power Identity, practicing pragmatic realism in an era of U.S.-China strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific, and then also rethinking Canadian defense engagement in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. Wow. So given this canvas that you provided to us of what's happening between China and the United States and in all the other countries in the Indo-Pacific, does Canada have any role? What is Canada's role? How does Canada's role change?
So Canada has a big role in the region, but it's not the role that I think we would love to have. In the 1990s, we were really at the heyday of Canadian, I think, global power, diplomatic influence. And this was before China's economy really came online, right? Before the Indian economy came online, before Southeast Asia was really important. And of course, before some other economies were on the rise. But today, Canada's status, its comprehensive power has relatively fallen, and we've seen other countries really emerge. And China is number two comprehensively. India is now going to be the third or fourth largest economy. Indonesia, Southeast Asia. So we've maintained a position. But we've actually fallen compared to all these countries. And that means that we don't have the resources to influence places like we used to. So we can no longer act like the middle power that advocated for human rights and democracy promotion and all the good stuff that we love in Canada, because we don't have the political capital or the resources compared to those very, very, very big countries. In that sense, I think that Canada needs a fundamental shift in how we think about how we engage in diplomacy. Again, as much as we love human rights and democracy in Canada, these are really critical to our identity. Um, Coming to Vietnam or to India and talking about these issues just is not credible. It's better to come and talk about good governance, rooting out corruption, trade, the language that these countries are speaking. In that sense, Canada's role should be really about focusing on how it can enhance the trade within the region. I'm a firm believer in strengthening the relationships with the United States and trying to help share the burden of security and other issues in the United States, in the region, working with Japan and maybe South Korea on issues such as illegal fishing in the South China Sea or sanctions evasion with North Korea. But to think that Canada can have this broad, wide security impact in the Indo-Pacific region really is not, it's not borne out in the resources that we can bring to the region, or how Canada has relatively declined in terms of its diplomatic power and economic power compared to all the countries that have risen in the region that I'm living, but also even in Europe.
Why is Canada's political capital, diplomatic impact, etc., had this decline? Is it just natural because these other countries have economically grown, or have we done something wrong?
Both, both. So if you just put it into context, in 1997, the Chinese economy was maybe number 40 or number 50, and Canada was a G7 country. It still is a G7 country. But today, the Chinese economy is maybe a $17 trillion economy. India as well has gone from utter poverty to it will be the fourth largest economy this year or next year. So these countries have risen. Second, I think that, again, we've not updated our diplomacy and our priorities based on our resources. And that means that there's a mismatch. And that mismatch means we're not as effective as we used to be within the region. Three, and people like Dave Perry at the Canadian Global Institute or Global Affairs Institute or other security, defense, and security experts will tell you we haven't spent. We haven't spent on defense, and we are a delinquent underspender. And this means we don't have the resources, And back in November, I was on one of our visiting ships talking to the commander here in Tokyo, and he says, we just don't have enough sailors. We can't get the sailors. Even if we doubled our wages, we don't have the sailors. And we don't have the ships. I think our new ships were going to come into service in 2037. That's not a lot of help for the problems that exist today. So delinquent underspending, under prioritization has made us not as credible as we could be. And then lastly, I really think that the last 10 years of governance have demonstrated that we are subject to interference from some countries in our political system, and we didn't take security issues as seriously as we could have. And as a result, we're just not credible to our most critical partners, those Five Eye partners, the UK, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. Our lack of inclusion in the AUKUS agreement, that is a good example of that. But again, calls to remove Canada from the Five Eyes partnership as well suggests that we've invested over the past 10 years, and now our partners are saying either step up to the plate and invest, or perhaps take a secondary role within these partnerships.
Invest in what? Invest in just more ships, more sailors?
It's not just ships and sailors. It's taking security seriously, taking the changes in the region seriously, complementing partners through investing in the right defense equipment that we need, addressing the political interference that's taken place in Canada. These are serious issues that are of a big concern for our biggest partners, and without taking these seriously and investing seriously in these issues, it creates the impression from our closest allies that Canada is not a credible and reliable partner. And as a Canadian, this is sad to say, but this is the sentiment of some of our closest partners.
The sentiment in Asia, you're saying, is that Canada's not a credible and reliable partner. That's pretty negative.
It's pretty negative, but I don't mean just in Asia. I'm saying even in the U.S. And we share a 6,000 kilometer long border. Our trade is enormous with the United States, and our shared interest in North America is deep, enduring, and it's not going to change over the next 50, 100, 200 years, because we can't change these basic denominators of a relationship. And this means that we have to invest in the relationship. And of course, they have to invest in us as well.
So let's talk about political interference. This has been an issue that's come up in the current federal election quite a bit. Some people think it's a lot. Some people think, oh, it's a lot to talk about nothing. And other people say, well, there's not much we can do about it, because when we complained about India potentially having a role in assassinating Sikh extremists in Canada, we got blackballed by India when we potentially did what the Americans wanted by arresting and potentially shipping off to the United States a Chinese financial officer. They arrested and kept for, what was it, how many days, the two Michaels. So what do we need to do?
3 years.
What do we need to do from a political interference? Is it real? And what do we need to do?
So it's complicated, Brian. It's complicated because I think that the political interference that we face is targeting certain communities, and in particular our Chinese Canadian communities that primarily use Chinese language social media networks. And these are easily manipulated by, in this case, China and some of its instruments, to send messages about politicians and about their ideas to shape the voting patterns of Chinese Canadians. So they're one of the delinquent or serial interferers in our political system, but they're not the only one. And I think Russia has been doing this. Frankly, I think many of the pro-Palestinian groups have been doing this as well to try and shape the internal debate in Canada about what's happened between Israel and Gaza. And this shapes the voting patterns, and it shapes who is voted for and their positions. Even our foreign minister in her district in Quebec, it's very difficult for her to take a principled position on what's happening in the Middle East, because her voters, frankly, are primarily supporters of an independent Palestinian state. And I'm not taking a position on this. I'm drawing a link between how interference affects voting patterns and affects who we choose as leaders and their decisions of how they address the very, very challenging issues we face in our international community today, whether that's the war in Ukraine, whether it's the tragedy of what's happened in Gaza, whether it's China. If we have foreign interference that shapes our voters. We choose leaders that take softer positions or positions that may not be in the interests of Canada's long-term national interests.
So Matt Gaetz endorsed Pierre Poilievre this past weekend. Some people said that's foreign interference, and some people said that actually is helpful because Matt Gaetz is the worst person, the last person you want to have actually endorse you. Does America have foreign political interference in Canada, or because it's public, so public, it doesn't matter?
So what we do in terms of distinguishing between foreign interference that is kind of nefarious and then the normal influence that different countries have, if it's through trade, if it's through diplomats, this is influence, and I think this is something that's tolerated. And understood is that if we can, work with partners, that's fine. But when we are, dumping disinformation into the system to change how citizens think, this is again a completely different species. Now, who supports Mr. Carney or who supports Poilievre? You know, this can affect the voting patterns, but again, I don't think it's the same effect as various groups in our society consuming certain narratives about politicians or certain narratives about political parties that really are not borne out in the reality of those political parties. And social media has made this much easier for outside actors to shape the political views of different minority groups and majority groups, not only in Canada but other countries as well.
You talk about Canada's sort of image in the world, and you've traveled in Africa, you've traveled in Europe, you've traveled obviously in Asia. I have as well, not to nearly the extent as you, but I was always received very well. And the old image about being proud to have the Canadian flag on your backpack. I may not have done that, but I often had my Air Canada super elite card on my briefcase and on my luggage, et cetera, like that. And I was always received incredibly well. And in Africa, it was the Chinese that were sort of the loud, ugly Americans, if that I can use that sort of, that it was the loud person in Europe was the American that people didn't like. The loud person in Africa was the Chinese person that the locals necessarily, to a certain extent, didn't like. How is Canada respected or not respected? How are Canadians treated? What's the image of you as a Canadian traveling or other Canadians traveling abroad today?
So I think so as an ordinary Canadian, we're welcomed. People look at ordinary Canadians as friendly, rule abiding, conversational. They look at Canada as a peaceful country that really is not engaged in destabilizing behavior. So in that sense, Canada's image is really, really strong. And I think it depends on which part of the world you go to. So I was in Scandinavia recently. They love Canada. They share many values about diversity and democracy and human rights. Very, very kindred spirits. Where if you go to Southeast Asia, there's almost no knowledge. And in China, because of the arrest of Meng Wanzhou and other issues, and propaganda, quite frankly, the image of Canada is not as good as it used to be. So really, I think that we can't say how Canada is treated around the world or what is our image around the world. I think we have to go to different pockets and say, yeah, kindred spirits here. There's been a big deterioration in, let's say, in the Chinese context or the Indian context. Other parts of the world have no idea about Canada except it's cold. So, it's interesting. But at the political level, this is where it gets a little bit more interesting because, people like me or politicians, they look at the political issues between our different countries, and this is how they frame it. So India and Canada right now, because of the killing of the Sikh activist that you mentioned, who's Canadian, by the way, has really fundamentally created a problem in the bilateral relations, and that will probably change in the coming year. When we look at China, again, the relations right now are not good, but the Chinese are seeking to warm relations because they're worried about the United States. So any country that they can work with, they're going to work with. And again, this is a very economy of enemies kind of approach to working with Canada. They'd rather be friends with Canada right now, especially as relations with the United States are deteriorating. So Canada needs to understand these dynamics and work with these different countries and build that credibility in different ways. But understand that for some countries, we're a useful tool. For other countries, there's real shared values, and we have to balance this.
Stephen, one of the disappointments in Canada was that when Donald Trump was talking about annexing us, using economic coercion to annex us, to force us to become the 51st state, to wipe out the invisible artificial line between Canada and the United States. No one internationally came to defend us. The president of France didn't. The prime minister of the UK didn't. The King of England and the King of Canada, maybe he put on a Canadian maple leaf, but that was about it. And no one in Asia, as far as I know, said a thing. Would anyone come to support Canada if the United States annexed us?
So I think this is a really critical point, Brian. I think a lot of people have talked about Canada working with the EU to put pressure on the United States to push back on tariffs or work with Japan or resuscitate relations with China to put pressure on the United States. And you're right, nobody came to defend Canada's sovereignty and its position as an independent state. And I think it goes to show us that when push comes to shove, the individual national interests of each country and each region are prioritized over collective action against the United States. And this is because the United States has so much leverage. Let me give you an example. Japan's security is really dependent on its bilateral relationship with the United States. So if Japan was going to support Canada and push back and their prime minister say, stop talking about Canada as a 51st state, it's likely that the United States would threaten to withdraw their support for the alliance or for their trade relationship. If the Australians did this, it would be similar. If the Europeans did this, it would be similar. And this is the kind of leverage that the United States has. So we should be very careful about advocating for these kinds of, collective action against the United States because countries just won't do it. And if Canada is wagering that other countries are going to support its claims, at the risk of losing their security umbrella or their trade relations with the United States, it's a really bad bet.
They're not going to do it. Stephen,
No
this has
way.
been interesting. We're going to take a final break and come back with a quick concluding comment in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We've been chatting with Stephen Nagy, who is a political science professor in Tokyo, Japan. He's traveled around the world recently. He's written a lot of papers, both about what's going on in Asia, but also Canada's role. And Stephen, you're Canadian, I think, right?
That's right. From
And
Calgary.
you've got an interesting view living abroad and traveling all around the world and academically studying and writing about what's going on, not only from an international standpoint, but from a Canadian perspective standpoint. So you probably have a really interesting sort of outsider's view on Canada and what's going on right now. If you were the next prime minister, or maybe advising the next prime minister, whoever that prime minister would be, what would be your sort of agenda for them?
I think first of all is building national unity. What I've observed over the past, been away for a long time from Canada, is our national unity has been eroded, and I think it's been eroded because of policies that didn't support a single Canadian identity, but supported lots of different identities, and I think this has been a challenge. I think it's also really important that whoever is prime minister looks to Canadians and respects all Canadians. It's just so tangible every time a prime minister talks over the past 10 years, in particular, that it's almost like they look down on different parts of the country. And this is not good for leading. So I think consensus is really important in building that national cohesive identity. We need to do a lot to get our economy productive. Interprovincial borders is really important. Let's get rid of them as much as we can, increase the productivity, deal with some of the immigration challenges that we face. And that's not saying no to immigration. It's making immigration work better. I think this is really, really important. Building credibility in our foreign policy, which means not doing everything everywhere, but doing something consequential in our backyard and with our key partners. I think there's a big space for thinking about how we can create something similar to the United States, Peace Corps. If you know anything about it, where young Americans would work overseas or work in their country to on particular projects. So they build a sense of national identity and service. And I think that's something that would be really interesting for a Canadian Prime Minister to advocate for, where Canadians from Newfoundland to British Columbia to the Yukon to Quebec work with each other on development projects in the Arctic, maybe in some priority areas like the Pacific, to try and build a Canadian identity where we're working together. Too often, again, I think Albertans or Quebecers or people from Newfoundland or New Brunswick, they don't really see themselves as part of the same country. So I think there's a space there as well. And then lastly, we need to work on our economy. The economy needs to work for the rich, the middle class, and the poor. And here, I think we have a lot to do in terms of improving how our economy works for all of those parts of our Canadian society. And that means prioritizing jobs, education, skills, and the fundamentals that make a society stable. That's family.
I think we need to have you come back and run for some political office in Canada. Stephen Nagy, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Brian.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Tokyo, Japan, if you're interested, at www.saga960am.cl. My podcasts and videos go up on my website, briancrombie.com, and on social media, on YouTube, and on podcast servers as soon as the radio show gets broadcast to air. This has been a fascinating conversation. I'm on, as I said, every night, 6 o'clock. I'm also going to have a 2-hour special on election night. And we're going to be talking through with a whole bunch of different guests, a lot of these issues that Stephen has raised in the final comment tonight. And so if you're interested, on April 28th, 2-hour special, election night, tune in. Good night, everybody. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you.